This is part three in a series on sovereign homesteads, solving problems that pretty much everybody complains about. So this part was inspired by coming across an article that was in the Los Angeles Times in August of 2021, August 8th. And this article, which went across several pages, was about folks living off the grid or in more natural circumstances and how they are out of compliance, to quote the one of the headlines here. And in reading this, I'm once again reminded of the root injustice, being denied your birthright to sovereign land, water, and seed. And as I explained in part one, these particular natural resources, land, water, and seed, are special in that they are needed for survival, right? For the human being to survive on planet Earth, right? We need food, we need shelter, we need water, right? All of these are actually provided by land, water, and seed, which are pre-existing in nature. They are not created by man. I personally believe they were created by divinity, but whether you believe that or not is irrelevant because the fact holds true that they were not created by man, right? So I emphasize that point because if the three basic necessities of life were not created by any person, then how does it make sense that we should be okay with letting some people control those three basic necessities and then through controlling those necessities control other people, right? This is not rocket science. It's like such basic human dynamic here. You need food, you need water, and you need shelter, right? You need land, water, and seed, basically. You need a space to live and to sleep at night. You need food, you need water. And so if other people are in control of those three things, you are then dependent on them in order to survive, right? Like very basic observation, right? So why is that considered perfectly fine? Why is that considered just? It doesn't make any sense. Why would you accept that scenario? And the crazy thing about it is, if you weren't born into it, you probably wouldn't accept it, right? Like if you were on a boat with a bunch of people and somehow you got lost, out in the ocean and you ended up on some island. It was a uninhabited island and whatever, you didn't have any communications or anything like that, so you're stranded on this island with a bunch of people that were, just on vacation or something like that. And you all get off the boat on the island and it looks like you're gonna be there a long time, maybe for the rest of your lives. What would you do? Like what would be the reasonable thing to do? The reasonable thing to do would be, okay, well, let's see what's on the island here and let's share it with each other, right? That's just like basic decency, basic common sense, right? It wouldn't make sense for someone to say, I hereby declare this land my property, I am the ruler of this island and you all have to obey me. They'd be like, slow your roll there, wannabe tyrant. We're all human here. We didn't make this island. You didn't make this island. You didn't make these coconut trees. They're pre-existing in nature. We need them to survive. So the right thing to do is just to share it fairly with one another. We can all have our own space as well. We don't need to be aggressive towards each other in any way. We'll all cooperate in a friendly manner, you know, and just share this land, water, and seed so that we can survive without enslaving one another, right? Without being abusive towards one another. Right? That would be how sane people would deal with a situation like that, ending up on an uninhabited island with a bunch of other people, right? A handful of other people, whatever, the number doesn't matter. So why doesn't that carry over into so-called civilization? Oh, the only reason it doesn't carry over is because people are following nonsense, basically. People are following logical fallacies that deceive them into thinking, well, it's different. It's not this uninhabited island scenario. It's society. And you have a responsibility to blah, 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 social contract, blah, blah, blah. A bunch of bullshit, basically, to convince you that it's just for some people to deny you your birthright and rule over you by controlling what you need to survive, right? So I say all that to return to this article, which is just one of like infinite examples of descriptions of people going through immense hardship. You know, in the article, you read of this family who, of course, by the newspaper, you know, the media kind of talk in a, you know, kind of condescending way, like talking about them as if they're kind of ridiculous, you know, ridiculous nomads that just kind of backwoods or whatever, you know, like they just won't get with the program and they're, you know, possibly dangerous. You know, they talk about how they might not follow certain codes and, you know, start a fire and of course, you know, not not being on the grid and controlled is going to be painted as dangerous by these establishment institutions. And so these people, you know, in the interview, some of them were saying like, you know, my kid loves the nature. We all appreciate the forest and the beauty of the natural world. We like being able to swim in the river and so on. We just basically want to live our lives in a simple, natural way, not bother anyone and not be bothered by anyone. But they're sort of being made an example of like, well, actually, this is a problem. And so they're facing eviction, right? And in the interview too, it talked about how I think the father of one of these families was giving a lot of effort trying to find work, but you know, just work was very hit or miss. He wasn't able to earn enough income to pay rental fees that he had to pay for the land that they had their trailer on or whatnot. Again, you wouldn't have to pay rent if you had your birthright to sovereign homesteading land, right? If it's your sovereign land, that means you're the king of that land. You don't pay anyone else for it while you're living on the planet. It's your space. You know, if people didn't have to pay rent or mortgage or property tax, how would that not be an extremely beneficial thing for society? All these people struggling in poverty, right? What's the number one expense for most people, right? It's just having a place to rest your head at night, right? Paying the rent. If you had your own space, you wouldn't have to worry about that so much. You wouldn't have to worry about job availability, right? So you're dependent on the job to get the money to pay for the rent, which you shouldn't have to pay in the first place, right? And then when you can't find the job, where do you turn? To the government, right? Government assistance. But of course, with that government assistance comes all of these conditions where they control your life more and more, right? and probably want you to move into some housing in the city. They're not going to, just help you live off the grid. Um, Quite the opposite. They're basically coercing everyone out of a natural lifestyle, right, into these control grid cities. So things get worse and worse. Your life gets more and more controlled, less and less natural. More and more disturbances from that unnatural way of life, city life, everyone on top of each other, and all the myriad of disturbances, the noise pollution, the air pollution, water pollution, etc., lack of privacy, all of that, just compounds. But it all came from the same root injustice, which is being denied your birthright for sovereign homesteading land, water, and seed, right? To have a little sovereign homestead. Organic and vegan in particular, to keep it ethically consistent so that you're not enslaving other sentient beings or polluting the environment with chemicals and GMOs that are going to harm other people and animals, right? So to get real, brass tacks here, specifics, we're talking about a hectare. We're talking about like an acre or two of land that you need to have privacy and grow a sufficient vegetable garden, have an orchard, fruit and nut trees, right? And you don't need to be even 100% sufficient, self-sufficient with that. You could reach that. But if you have neighbors and family and friends also doing the same nearby, like walking distance nearby, you could share with one another. And that's what people naturally do, right? Like I was giving with that landing on the uninhabited island scenario, right? Natural inclination is actually just to share with one another, especially when you have an abundance. Like it's very natural for when people have their gardens and they have an abundance of tomatoes or whatever, that they just naturally want to share it with their neighbors, and their neighbors want to share whatever they have an abundance of. It's a natural gift economy, uncorrupted by the slavery of being denied your birthright. It's that simple. And yet, for whatever reason, that observation is absent. I mean, I understand why the powers that be wouldn't want that observation to be landed upon or spread. But I can't understand so much why people that are not part of these establishment institutions can't recognize that, and why they just keep going on about complaining about the branches to this root injustice rather than recognizing the root. We should all have our own sovereign land, water, and seed to form voluntary communities of sovereign veganic homesteads. Like that's just the natural, logical conclusion that you would come to if you just observed the world and thought, well, what would be just here? What would be the society without all this violence and slavery? Well, it would look like that. It would look like voluntary communities of sovereign veganic homesteads. Like it's not that complicated. Again, if this seems complex to you, I don't understand why, because if you were to just suddenly land into a situation like I described, you would come to a similar conclusion, right? Maybe you would, if there were animals on there, you might think, oh, we got to, hunt the animals. You might think that's a great idea, where you might disagree with me on that. But as far as the sharing goes, as far as like everyone having their own space, I think most people would agree, as being non-abusive towards other humans goes. Most people would agree there. Unfortunately, they think being abusive towards animals is a good thing or a necessary thing. But, even if you only followed me as far as sovereign homesteads and you can't quite handle being non-abusive towards animals, that's just too extreme. My point being, it's not that crazy an idea at all. It's just basic human decency, basic common sense. just following our own natural inclination to not be sadistic abusers, right? Like, why are you accepting a system that is just basically a form of slavery and thinking that we need to have this in order to have, peace and justice in the world? It makes no sense. Slavery does not further peace and justice, it furthers the complete opposite. Basic ethic that could solve so many problems, from economic to, interpersonal, to dealing with tyrannical governments, right? They wouldn't exist. People, all complaints against government are all just branches of that root injustice, right? If there was no governments, if everyone was sovereign individuals, that solves all of that. All tyranny, all communism, all, corruption, you know, all of that gone, right? And in the same newspaper, they were talking about the mystery of whales dying in the Pacific, right? And in the whole article, of course, they don't talk about anything like military technology, sonar, or, anything like that. Radiation coming from, you know, from industry and military in particular, and government, like, and all toxic chemicals also being pushed out by these industries and institutions, right? All the worst damage and disharmony is coming from these giant institutions that wouldn't even exist if we all just recognized that we should treat one another as sovereign individuals with our sovereign birthrights. That disallows the creation of all these destructive institutions. Those institutions only exist because the root injustice is in place. It's that simple. Like, once you get that, you can observe all of these problems in the world and realize, well, that wouldn't even exist if we didn't tolerate the root injustice. It would have never gotten to that extent. In part one, I give the example of the Chinese man who stands in front of the tanks at Tiananmen Square. Again, a very brave act. But eventually the tanks kept rolling, right? At that point, what could he really do? What could a defenseless man do, other than kind of give this symbolic resistance, which, again, very brave, but you don't have to let it get to that point, right? Like I was, again, talking about in part one, you don't have to see this cycle of, like, tyranny and revolution over and over and over again as this, like, inevitable part of human history and society. It doesn't have to be that way. The reason it keeps regrowing is because you never took out the roots. You never addressed the root evil that is still in place. And if you were to remove that, then you wouldn't have all of these large institutions that are extremely destructive getting to grow to the size that they grow to. It's really that simple. All right, thanks for listening.